Okay. In this problem, we're going to work towards finding the inverse of a function, right? You can find this information and other examples on page 449, right? So what do we recall about finding inverses? Well, if I have my function is 2 sine x minus 1, and notice the restricted domain, so that it's 1, so that this function is 1 to 1, then I have that x is going to be equal to 2 sine of y minus 1 if I want to start the process of finding the inverse, right? Because all I'm going to do is switch, right? If I think of this as y equals, I'm just switching the x and the y. And now I'm going to solve for y, right? So my next step would be x plus 1 equals 2 sine of y, which all I did was add 1 to both sides. And then I could follow that up with x plus 1 over 2 is equal to the sine of y, dividing both sides by 2. And from there, I would have my response. And that is that y, the inverse function, right, is going to be the inverse sine of x plus 1 over 2. Because I can undo this function using the inverse sine, right? And notice that I've had this restricted domain, so I can do this directly. Okay, so there is my inverse function. Okay, and of course, remember that the inverse sine is also written as the arc sine, right? That we can write it in this way with the superscript, and we can also write it in this way. Both of these refer to the inverse sine. Okay. What about another one of these? Well, let's come down here and look at number or part of C. Right here we have a function, and it's 3 cosine of 2t minus 1. Notice with 2t, right, that I changed this domain. That usually I have a restricted domain from 0 to pi, but now with this 2t, I'm going to restrict the domain from 0 over 2 to pi over 2. Right? How would I answer this question to find the inverse? Well, first, I would switch that x and y, that idea, except for here I'm using a t. So t equals 3 cosine of 2y minus 1. Which, if I continue the work, add 1 to both sides, t plus 1 equals 3 cosine of 2y. Divide both sides by 3, t plus 1 over 3 equals the cosine of 2y. Okay, so I'm almost there to finding my inverse. What would be that next step? That next step would be to undo the cosine function, and I can undo the cosine function by taking the inverse cosine of both sides, and so I have 2y is equal to the inverse cosine of t plus 1 over 3. But I am not done yet. I'm tasked with finding the inverse, right? So essentially solving for y after I've switched my variables, right? And notice the notation to represent the inverse of this function h of t, right? So y, which represents the inverse, and that's going to be given by 1/2 the inverse cosine of t plus 1 over 3. Okay, why 1/2? Well, if I divide this side by 2, I divide that side by 2, and dividing by 2 is like multiplying by 1/2. So here is my inverse. Okay. Of course, you've got quite a few additional problems that you can practice on your own. Right? If you have questions for clarification, be sure that you ask them.